They asked for a story that reads like history and an economic thriller. Here is the finished script. Continuous narration, ready for voiceover. After the script, I list the sources and the 3 headline facts with their references. The city was quiet until the vaults were not. A whole economy can smell fear. The scrape of boots outside a teller window, the soft clink of a coin counted twice, the hush of a courtroom as a clerk reads a bank's failure aloud. Why did ordinary accounts, the small savings of factory hands and farmers, become the loose thread that unraveled entire regions? That is the mystery we follow. How America's money system, before the Fed, kept producing sudden bitter collapses, and how each collapse taught a lesson the country could not ignore. In the early 19th century, you could still buy land with hard coins and a handshake. By the 1830s, the nation had more banks than people trusted. One quick fact anchors this period. By some counts, nearly half of the country yes banks failed in the Panic of 1837. 343 closed out of roughly 850. That is not a statistic. It is a scene. Mothers waiting by closed doors, farmers watching their notes dissolve into worthlessness. It is where a fragile credit web first showed its danger to ordinary life. Credit in the 1800s was a social contract made of paper and faith. A merchant extended a ledger entry because he believed the farmer's next harvest would come. A bank issued a note because it assumed other banks would honor it tomorrow. When that trust cracked, the contract collapsed. Land speculation, state bond defaults, and a sudden squeeze on specie all conspired in 1837 to turn promise into panic. The mechanics are simple and brutal. When depositors ran, banks with illiquid loans could not convert assets fast enough into cash. A single forced sale depressed prices, which made other loans look risky, which fed the next withdrawal. The dominoes fell. Fast forward to the gilded noise of 1907, brass lamps, ticker tape, men in stiff collars, arguing over a phone line that sounds like a distant storm. The panic began with a failed corner in copper and a few reckless speculators, but it did not stay small. Within weeks, the New York Stock Exchange had lost almost half its value from the previous year. Banks and trust companies that seemed solvent in daylight found themselves deserted at midnight by frightened depositors. Here, too, the financial logic is merciless. Institutions that had grown large and interconnected relied on short-term credit and public confidence. When rumors turned into withdrawals, the networks seized up. The human scene is what makes the mechanics land. Picture a clerk at the Knickerbocker Trust in mid-October, the ledger open, the ink drying. Men line up in the rain. A teller counts out small bundles of bills and watches a widow clutch them like a rosary. Outside, brokers shout. Inside the boardroom, the great financiers of the city meet. One account of that night has a financier summoning the trust company presidents to his private library, locking the doors and forcing them to face the arithmetic, raise a pooled fund, or watch the system disintegrate. It reads like myth, but the numbers are not myth. J.P. Morgan and his partners organized a rescue that hinged on pooled resources of tens of millions of dollars, and by one ledger, Morgan's firm recorded losses in the order of $21 million that year. The rescue worked enough to slow the panic, but the remedy itself made a political point. National finance had no official lifeguard. It had private men with private ledgers. Every panic is a lesson in incentives. Before the Fed, local banks raced to issue notes, and trust companies competed for deposits without the same safety nets. Profits were private. Failures were public. When a collapse hit, ordinary people paid with lost wages, shuttered shops, and savings gone to paper. The distribution effect is stark. Wealthy financiers might lose a percentage. Workers lost livelihoods. That contrast repeats across the century. A merchant in Cincinnati could lose his line of credit, while a railroad magnate suffered unrealized losses on paper. Both experienced pain, but the ripple hit the many most harshly. There is a micro-anecdote I return to because it humanizes the arithmetic. In 1907, a seamstress named Maria walked to the bank with a handful of pay envelopes after a week of temp work. She handed them to the teller, who looked up and said quietly that the bank had temporarily suspended withdrawals. Maria went home and counted her coins by lamplight, turned the small pile over in her palm, and thought through a different kind of accounting. Could tomorrow's rent be delayed? Could the grocer wait? Her problem was not theory, it was dinner. Her small crisis multiplied into a larger social strain, and the same pattern repeats in every panic. Micro-pain composes macro-crisis. Hold that image while we move through cause and effect. Banks expand credit in good times because competition rewards growth. They fund long-term projects with short-term liabilities because yields look attractive. That balance sheet mismatch is the place where panic seeds itself. Then a shock, a commodity corner, a failed railroad, a foreign withdrawal, collapses confidence. Depositors demand cash. Banks scramble. Interbank markets freeze. The techniques that might have relieved the strain. A lender of last resort, elastic currency, central clearing, do not exist. So private actors improvise. They pool funds. They issue clearinghouse loan certificates. They lobby urgently for legal changes. The political fallout is swift and consequential. After 1907 came a wave of legislation designed to prevent the next private rescue. Congress passed emergency measures that allowed banks to issue temporary currency, and then created a National Monetary Commission to design systemic reform. Senator Nelson Aldrich would soon travel, study European central banks, and say, plainly, that the country needed institutional scaffolding to prevent private men from being the only safety valve. That led, within a decade, to the Federal Reserve Act, a public response to private failure. But reform is not a cure-all. It changes the battlefield. A central bank can offer liquidity, but it also concentrates responsibility and power. The memory of men like Morgan, who could seal library doors and marshal fortunes, feeds popular distrust. The quoted line from Aldrich captures the irony. He observed, with no shame, that a centralized reserve would allow New York bankers to dominate reserves across the whole country. Reform rearranged who held the keys. Midway through this story, stop and think about how this matters now. If this makes you look at your bank balance differently, hit subscribe, and we will keep pulling these threads. The pattern of shadow banks becoming systemically important, of short-term funding for long-term bets, appears again and again in American history. The same structural failure that made trust companies fragile in 1907 echoed in 2008, when market plumbing around mortgage credit froze. The instruments change, the headlines change, but the logic is familiar. Leverage plus liquidity, mismatch plus interconnection equals danger. We owe ourselves 3 takeaways from these forgotten panics. First, credit is a promise that must be supported by a system, not by personality. Institutions matter as much as balance sheets. Second, when profit is private and loss is public, political pressure will eventually force reform. But that reform will always redistribute power. Third, everyday people's savings are the true casualty of panic. Policies should be judged by whose losses they prevent, not by whose profits they preserve. There is a final, brittle reflection. Panics teach a civic math. Liquidity is not charity. It is public infrastructure. The question then becomes moral as well as technical. Who should hold the fire hose when the flames spread? Should it be private vaults or a public system designed to keep commerce flowing? The rest of this ledger is still being written. If this shifted how you see history and money, join us, subscribe, and let's keep searching for the patterns they do not teach you in school. The rest of this story is waiting in the ledgers.